You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you, with Paul Gardner and Todd Wood.
But it's important that we think about methodological questions, and we face lots of scientific challenges as young Earth creationists, and we want to know how do we go about solving some of those challenges. And the approach that we both like is something that we call model building. We are interested in building scientific models. And so I guess we should begin there and say something about what a scientific model is. Yeah. Todd, do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, let me give you a real quick rundown here. So, most of you probably can remember back to your learning about science in school, primary school or high school or whatever, and you learned that science starts out with observations. You then formulate a hypothesis. You test the hypothesis with experiments and more observations, and then it becomes a theory if it holds true. And then after you rigorously testing the theory, it'll become a law. And the sort of end product of science then is knowledge. It is, and that's the Latin scientia. That's what it means. It means knowledge. And so science is after truth, and we do it through this process of repeated observations that lead to more and more confidence in our assumptions, and then to truth. That is not really how science works, right? I mean, and it's strange to me that it has lasted so long, and that everybody seems to know this process of the scientific method, because it's not generally how science works. There's sort of, I guess, I like to think of it as sort of two kind of levels of science. There's sort of the high-level science that is model building, but then there's the low-level science where you sort of try to take ideas and apply them and test them. And that's where you sort of get this caricature of the scientific method. But a model is different from that. A model is sort of looking across big parts of science, big stuff, and trying to propose a way to explain a lot of information. Great example here that I think we can follow fairly consistently is the way that in the early modern period we went from thinking that the Earth was the center of the cosmos, or close to it, and that everything revolved around it, to our modern conception of the universe, where the Earth is a planet like the other planets in orbit around the sun. So the idea of planets orbiting the sun and the Earth orbiting the sun was fairly old. It was really sort of given new life by Copernicus in 1543, and a book where he basically said this might explain certain pieces of data. And some of that was, one of the observations that people had always made is that Venus and Mercury always appear in the sky very close to the sun, which was an odd thing if you thought that Venus and Mercury were orbiting the Earth. Why would it have to be always close to the sun? And Copernicus said, well, if they're planets orbiting the sun, then that would explain why you always see them close to the sun. And then later, but the mathematics of Copernicus' model were just as complicated as everybody else's mathematics. And it wasn't until the early 17th century that Kepler came along and said, the orbits of the planets are actually not perfectly circular. They're slightly off circular. They're elliptical. And this was pretty revolutionary at the time. And people began to, their math was much better. And so the model that they had, this mathematical description of how the heavens moved, became improved because they realized orbits aren't circular, orbits are elliptical. And then comes along Isaac Newton, who has this idea of gravity, and gravity then can suddenly explain why there are elliptical orbits, how the planets stay up there in orbit, how the Earth stays in orbit. And most surprisingly of all was that he gave an account of why there are tides, which is something no one ever really thought about. Why would tides be connected to the motion of the heavens? But it turns out the moon has a gravitational pull that pulls on water, and so it makes the tides. And so suddenly people realized that this model of the universe, which put the sun in the middle and put the rest of the planets, including the Earth, in orbit around it, this was more powerful. And so you have this gradual improvement, step by step, as the model gets more and more precise and more capable of explaining what we observe in the cosmos. And of course, later then we get Einstein coming along and fixing some of the issues that Newton had. But that's way complex. We don't need to talk about that. But yeah, so the idea there is that you're not just proposing one little hypothesis to explain some observation that you see, and that hypothesis comes out of nowhere. You're creating an explanation for basically everything that you observe in the night sky, right? Why are these things the way they are? Why do they do what they do? And that's what a model is.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.